2005 was a monumental year in film viewing for me. Thanks to my parents securing a DVR, I was able to expand my horizons and found many great and wonderful films I never had the opportunity to view before. However, I had 3 films that I wasn't sure what to make of on my first viewing: Jaws, Dr. Strangelove, and A Hard Day's Night. I knew these were iconic, but I was a bit put off because I wasn't sure what to expect going into them, so I was unprepared for their content. Thankfully, Jaws clicked with me on my second viewing. Dr. Strangelove has grown to be one of my most admired films, and the jury's still out on A Hard Day's Night. This is still an unusual experience for me, as I'm usually pretty quick in figuring out if a film is my cup of tea or not. That doesn't mean my feelings can't change over time, but I'm rarely left befuddled by a movie for too long. So what does this all have to do with Skyfall? Well, Skyfall is the one Bond film I've never been sure what my feelings are on it. It may help you to understand that I was unable to view this film until 2014 for several reasons, and so a lot of the perfect storm of circumstances that led to it grossing $1 billion at the box office was long gone by the time I saw it. I wasn't swept up in the patriotic British pride of the Olympics, I was 2 years removed from the 50th anniversary celebrations, and Spectre was just around the corner in starting up on its production and hype, so I was already looking forward to the next adventure before I got around to seeing this one. So it meant that the film had to win me over purely on its own merits, unaided by hype. And it did, just not to the degree I was hoping for. I knew this was a good film, but I still left my first viewing slightly disappointed. Thankfully, I knew better than to take a first viewing as gospel truth, and over the years, I've come to appreciate and admire Skyfall on a level like I have no other Bond film, even if it still misses out on being in my top 10 of the series. Work started in earnest on Bond 23 shortly after the release of Quantum of Solace. However, 2010 put a stop to pre-production efforts when MGM filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, meaning it was going to undergo reorganization in an effort to avoid closing. The strategy worked, and MGM reached another agreement with Sony, allowing for the production of both Bond 23 and 24. As to who the director would be, it was an easy choice. Daniel Craig reunited with his friend Sam Mendes at a party and brought up the topic. Mendes expressed interest and was immediately approved of by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson. This was actually even before the bankruptcy, and he remained linked to the project right up through the actual production. It wasn't intentional, but the delays provided the filmmakers the opportunity to release a movie in 2012, coinciding with both the London Olympics and the 50th anniversary of the series. It seemed as though fate was on the side of Eon this time, as not only did they have an Oscar-winning director helming the film, but they were able to run through their wish list for this one. Javier Bardem, who had been talked about as far back as The World Is Not Enough, and had even been considered for the Halle Berry Jinx solo film, was finally signed on to play a villain. Albert Finney, a veteran actor whose film debut was in Harry Saltzman's The Entertainer, agreed to play a key part. Ralph Fiennes, a one-time contender for the role of Bond, would play Mallory, a bureaucrat who would have a larger role in the films to come. The film also provided the opportunity to reintroduce classic Bond elements like the gadgets, thus heralding the return of the Gadget Master, and M's secretary, Miss Moneypenny. The script, written by longtime collaborators Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, would be given a polish by Tony and Golden Globe-winning scribe John Logan. Most of the talented crew from the previous films would return, as well as being joined by renowned cinematographer Roger Deakins and composer Thomas Newman. For the 50th anniversary of the most influential movie series to date, it seemed like this one was in great hands, and only time would tell if it was a winner. During a mission to recover a stolen hard drive, James Bond is accidentally shot by a fellow agent on M's orders and is presumed dead. 3 months later, M is facing the consequences of that operation and Bond is living off the grid. A cyber attack results in the destruction of MI6's headquarters, and it is made clear that M's past has come back to haunt her. As soon as Bond is made aware of this, he promptly returns to London. But it is also evident that he has been shaken and is off his game, not fit for active service. Taking an ill-advised leap of faith, M sends Bond out to find the perpetrators of this attack, starting with the man who stole the hard drive and eventually leading to a disgraced and rage-filled former agent who wishes to prove a point about M's leadership and have the higher powers question their safety when their intelligence and security efforts are trusted to an aging handsome man in a tuxedo with a Walther. Skyfall has so many great elements that I love. It's a film that has grand ideas to ponder, fantastic performances, and a sense of groundedness that I usually go for. However, I felt as if it was bereft of either the visceral or bombastic thrills I wanted. It's not that the action or suspense scenes were bad, they just felt so low-key in their setup, and are shot in a way that makes me feel disconnected from a lot of them. I felt they were more appropriate for an Oscar-winning conspiracy thriller than a Bond film. Plus, I felt like the artistic sensibilities and goals of Sam Mendes were a bit heavy-handed, getting in the way of the escapist entertainment this series is known for, and that heritage is something this film is keenly aware of. Over the years, I've had quite the change of heart, but I still feel like I'm missing something. Let me make it clear. Some of my problems with this film that I'm about to go over are purely nitpicks or circumstantial issues, not really fundamental flaws that make me wonder how anyone could place this film at the top of their rankings. So don't take them personally if this is one of your very favorites. The first and most prominent issue I have with the film is how it follows on from Craig's first two outings. Forgive me, but I was under the assumption that after we closed off the origin story with Quantum that we'd be getting back to business as usual. I also had this same feeling when Casino Royale ended, but Quantum convinced me that it had to put the consequences of Vesper's betrayal to rest first before we could get back to that, so I made an exception. Skyfall is a really odd story to act as the third big screen Craig outing because one of its primary themes is that Bond is outdated and past his prime. It doesn't make sense to me within the context of Craig's tenure that we're already in a never say never again place with him. I understand this is more a meta-commentary on the series as a whole, and that maybe the assumption was that Craig went on several adventures that we hadn't seen, like perhaps he experienced some version of the other 20 films like the video game 007 Legends suggested. However, not only has some of that logic since been defeated by the existence of Spectre, but it's the same problem I have with The Dark Knight Rises. We had two films closely related to each other in themes and timeline placement, and then we make a dramatic leap forward towards the end of the man's career, acting like we've spent more time with him in his prime than we have. Because Spectre is a direct sequel to Skyfall and No Time to Die picks up just after Spectre, my understanding is that Casino Royale and Quantum are set in 2006. And then Skyfall is probably 2014, since Spectre is 2015, and the bulk of No Time to Die would be in 2020. That's a pretty big gap, and it feels really off-putting that suggests that Craig's Bond is past his prime in only his third on-screen outing, and especially since his second was essentially an extension of the first. Again, this is just a personal preference and nothing that's fundamentally wrong with the film, but I really question this choice. Maybe this is just a me thing and was a case of unrealistic expectations and flawed readings of the past two films, but I sure thought we'd be getting back to something more routine with Craig this time out. You can imagine how frustrated I was the first time watching Skyfall that it ended a Craig film for the third time in a row with a promise that we'd be getting back to a more standard adventure next time. The other problem I have is the choice of primary thematic substance. Determining Bond is still relevant is not only something that was tackled with Die Another Day, a film that just 10 years earlier served as the 40th anniversary celebration, but Casino Royale also arguably did this too, without making it an explicit subject just 6 years earlier. I know this series has a problem of repeating certain tropes and themes, but after GoldenEye, Die Another Day, and Casino Royale all tackled this question, a fourth film in 17 years circling around this same notion is starting to seem excessive, and like we're beating the nail further into the wood than it needs to go. It starts to make the character feel like a one-trick pony if his only universally acclaimed entries are just justifying his existence. Okay, now that I've addressed those 2 points, let me praise this film as much as my Bond fan heart will allow. Every time I've watched this, it has gotten better and better. And after listening to the director's commentary with Sam Mendes, I think I'm prepared to say this may be my second favorite Craig film, and is right alongside The Living Daylights on the edge of being in the top 10. That is quite the journey from where it started for me, and perhaps over time it may eventually earn a spot in the top 10. But I'm very happy to have come around on it a bit more now. In fact, this is the film I've rewatched the most in preparation for one of these videos. And that's because there was so much material I felt like I was sleeping on and had to digest that I had no idea where to start in writing this review. Let's begin with the film's structure. Mendes is keenly aware of the chances he is taking here, since unlike Mark Forster in the last film, he grew up a Bond fan and was very familiar with both the films and Ian Fleming's works. He starts the film with Bond symbolically dying. This is actually a trope that goes back to the early days of the series. From Russia with Love, Thunderball, and You Only Live Twice all began with teasing the death of Bond, with Twice being the most explicit. However, Skyfall is the best version of this because it's not just a cheap thrill or part of the setup. It's an actual factor in the story that goes beyond the first few minutes. Bond must undergo a resurrection himself and regain the confidence of everyone around him, including himself. He fails the evaluations of MI6, the hedonistic lifestyle he indulges in does nothing to fulfill him, and he walks around in a zombie-like trance. It's not until he's made aware of a threat to England that he starts to reawaken. Bond's sense of duty has always been a key factor in the previous films, but here it's treated as the core of the character. It is his purpose. It is the thing that gives his life meaning since he has closed himself off to relationships and a family at this point, and it's perhaps the only thing that would snap him out of a self-indulgent lifestyle that many of us would love to have. It's something that proves the filmmakers have a keen understanding of Bond's character. Without that purpose, Bond merely exists, not gaining anything substantial from his party-like environment. A lot of parodies and casual audiences will focus on the refined lifestyle that seems like a vacation as key to the character. But what they fail to understand is that this is the window dressing of Bond's life, not a linchpin. This is a beat that is reinforced in No Time to Die. It's only when he has a mission to tackle that Bond comes alive again, despite always living in more exotic locations. M sends Bond on what is likely a suicidal mission based on little but faith, a nice harkening back to the novel The Man with the Golden Gun. By the way, I'm glad we've moved beyond the idea of M's unconfidence in Bond as a theme after Quantum. The problem becomes that Silva is more than a worthy match for Bond, and if you imagine a rogue Bond against MI6, he would make an amazing threat, much as GoldenEye proved. After the inquiry scene where Silva almost kills M, Bond takes her somewhere where he can dictate the terms of the engagement. Even though there aren't as many guns as he hoped for when he gets there, Bond can still have time to prepare the home against Silva's men, and yet the technology they have eventually gets taken away. All their traps are gone before Silva even arrives. He destroys the DB-5. Bond even destroys his family home to take out the helicopter, and eventually it all comes down to a knife which takes out Silva. With the death of M, the film needs a pick-me-up before we leave it, much as Star Trek II does with the image of Spock's coffin, or Casino Royale does with Bond finally uttering his most famous line. So the film ends with a celebration of the series' roots. Bond flirts with Moneypenny before being ushered into M's office where he receives a new mission, and then the gun barrel. Basically, the film ends with the reassuring elements that traditionally start a Bond adventure, signaling that he is finally back home and that all of the films that preceded it are part of cinematic history and have enriched it. Obviously, I still have the aforementioned problem that we still have yet to have a more classic Craig adventure, and thus we've now spent 3 films with Craig becoming something closer to the James Bond we all know and love. Yet confined to just this film, this is a wonderful way to emotionally re-energize the audience. We start with the death of Bond, have him reaffirm his place within our hearts, and then reward us with some of the coziest imagery from the earlier films. It's grin-inducing. For the longest time, most of my actual issues with the film revolved around the third act. It seems so in line with the rest of the film's action scenes, a more mundane setting, not featuring the big visual awesomeness we've come to expect from the series, and that the last 2 films continued to deliver. Basically, I never felt like the film was building towards something bigger, and that disappointed me on a thrill-seeking level. However, I've come around to appreciate how this finale thematically ties into the picture, and I'd be lying if I said nothing is interesting or exciting about this ending. Most of us have made fun of it for copying elements from Home Alone, with Sam Mendes even bringing it up on the commentary. The point is to show that Bond makes the best use of what little he has at his disposal, and there's something so satisfying in seeing both the initial setup of the traps and the payoff. Yes, I think Kevin McAllister somehow pulls this off in a more entertaining way than Bond does, but there are 2 observations about this climax that makes me appreciate it more. First, this is a climax that has a lot in common with old westerns, showcasing less of the fantastic technology in favor of putting the determination of the protagonist and antagonist against each other on display. It's a duel between the Titans over their faith in M and the mission. And second, Mendes consciously made the scene feel like it very well could have taken place in 1962, which is a cool way to acknowledge the longevity of the series. Mendes in this film seems very aware of the public expectations and likely future backlash he may receive surrounding the finished product, and I love that he does his best to sell us on his ideas without making apologies for them. Seeing Bond's home and acknowledging his past is a notion that many fans will not care for. Yet I love that Bond himself refuses to talk about the place in his past, keeping the details hidden from us, but making it crystal clear how he feels about it, culminating in a great one-liner before he blows the place up. Thus, Bond never tries to make a connection between the place and his past to what he's doing now, and I love that. His childhood died the day his parents died, and I love seeing their gravestones, by the way, and a new man emerged, one who would eventually grow up to be the hero we're following now. And Bond sacrifices the last vestige of his past, or so he thinks, to destroy Silva. Thus, finally, he can dedicate himself to the job at hand in protecting the world from devastating threats. Vesper was right in that M recognized Bond's past as being a reason why he could dedicate himself to king and country. And we see all throughout the movie that his self-admitted, pathetic love of country is what drives him to be the extraordinary hero that he is. And I'm inclined to think this was also true of the classic Bond as well. M's death is unfortunately an idea that does little for me. I love how it serves the film's themes and how we can feel the weight on Bond, but personally I never loved or hated the idea. Maybe it was because Craig's era is marked with an ongoing story arc and character development, so deaths of central characters wouldn't feel as out of place as they would have in the classic series. It could also be because I felt as though there would have to be a time we'd say goodbye to Judi Dench as the character, since she had actually played the role for as long as Bernard Lee had when he passed, so I was ready for the possibility. But quite honestly, I think it was because the death felt so telegraphed to me while watching the film for the first time. Thankfully, nobody spoiled M's fate for me in the 2 years it took for me to see the movie. But with Judi Dench's credit appearing in front of a grave, the bell tolling as M looked out the window with a sense of melancholy, Mallory's line about M having a great run, how the movie is all about death in a sense, how clearly we see M's bloody wounds in the lead up to the death, and the fact that we find M in an abandoned chapel next to a graveyard, it felt like the movie was flashing the death in neon lights to me, so I wasn't blindsided or unprepared for the moment. While I think the death is entirely appropriate for this story, it does not move me in the same way that Vesper's or Tracy's deaths have in the past. Skyfall is steeped in Ian Fleming. Each of the last 3 Craig films pulls from the later Fleming works, particularly unused elements of You Only Live Twice and The Man with the Golden Gun. What's interesting to me is that these are both novels whose film counterparts deviated wildly from their source material, making them more adaptations in name only in comparison to films like From Russia with Love or Majesty's Secret Service. These are also some of the less regarded Fleming works, and so it's reassuring to me that the creators are true fans of Fleming. They don't just stick to the famous books and take universally beloved elements, they mine what good ideas are left over from some of the weaker books, showing their appreciation for the author isn't diminished by public reception to those entries. And this film wonderfully captures the moody Bond, a version that isn't talked about as much with the public, partly because I suspect public knowledge of the book version is limited to Casino Royale, but one that is definitely there, particularly in You Only Live Twice. But perhaps even more impressive is the film's reverence for the movies that came before. It probably goes without saying that I think this serves as a much better celebration film than Die Another Day, and part of that is in the use of homages. Whereas Die Another Day felt like it couldn't go 2 minutes without throwing in another reference and making sure that each film was directly called out, Skyfall wisely chooses a few select films and works in the references more naturally. Goldfinger is the big one, what with the DB5 being the one from that adventure, You Must Be Joking, and the reintroduction of the tiny radio gadget. But I also noted direct callbacks or connections to GoldenEye in one of the film's funniest lines, License to Kill, Live and Let Die, and Casino Royale. I would also throw in 3 more films having less obvious connections. I've already covered Die Another Day's connections in the review for that film, so I won't repeat myself. Another is Dr. No, in that the villain operates off a deserted island and creates a mystique about himself that both inspires and terrifies his underlings, as well as featuring a bit of art that was missing at the time of filming. The final film is A View to a Kill. This may seem like a stretch, but hear me out. The villain is a blonde-haired former agent working against Bond. The madness is evident. His scheme involves technology as a key component. There is a competition of skill that the villain believes Bond will lose, and the villain dies in a less spectacular fashion. This may be mere coincidence, but I'd like to think it's deliberate, mostly because I'd love to think the filmmakers are respectful of the entire series. Love or hate some of the more maligned entries in the franchise, they are nevertheless part of the grand Bond tapestry that has been woven over the years. And I'm always more happy to see acceptance of the good and the bad over simply retconning or taking the mickey out of a panned work. This may just be wishful thinking on my part. Daniel Craig continues to shine in this film. It was a bit surprising at the time to see that unlike the other Bond actors, Craig plays the character differently in every entry, showcasing an evolving man, but it was a move I quickly grew to love. Bond's arc is defined by his faith in M and the mission. While he has presented solid evidence to disregard those things, particularly by Silva, Bond makes a conscious choice not to change. In character arcs, there is usually the opportunity for change, a time when the protagonist makes a pivotal decision in his journey, and we learn something about him based on that choice. I find a lot of heroes refuse to change, to give in to the madness and self-indulgence that the villain presents. This is a particularly great thing to do in this film, where we got a good glimpse earlier about what Bond would do with his life without the mission. So I appreciate even more why he chooses to go back into the service. This faith in M and the mission is also the reason why I'm fine with no main Bond woman in the vein of so many of the other films. Severine and Moneypenny provide us with all the sexiness we could want, and M's relationship is entirely different with Bond. While I would say she takes the position of main Bond woman in this outing, I like that each of the Craig films have a different relationship from each other. Vesper and Madeline represent the two great loves of his life, bookending it. Camille is a friend who helps him in his journey after Vesper's death, and M is more of a motherly figure who reminds him of the personal fulfillment he gets in his work. It's great stuff, and Craig plays the part wonderfully here, particularly nailing the subtle humor in the role and selling us the best he can with Bond's affection towards M. Judi Dench has been a treat in each of the 7 films she has appeared in. Her role has certainly morphed since GoldenEye, especially since the Craig films made a big push towards making her more than just the mission briefer. Skyfall gives us her finest work in the series. The film is just as much about M as it is about Bond, perhaps even more so since the catalyst for the film is M's mistakes, both past and present. I'm not sure I'd declare it Oscar-worthy, but it is the culmination of 17 years worth of work with the character, and it's the main reason that she's in the running for the best M in the series alongside Bernard Lee. It may also help that she quotes an amazing bit from Tennyson in the inquiry scene. The producers wanted to get Javier Bardem into the series for a while, and I'm so glad it was with this role. I was already aware of and impressed with Bardem based on his amazing work in No Country for Old Men, but much like Christopher Lee and Christopher Walken before him, he just walks into the film and instantly cements himself as one of the greats. I was initially put off by how close I felt he was to a Batman villain. The deliberate surrendering and capture bit did not help, but I quickly put that criticism to bed. I love that his scheme has more to do with M, but it also centers around Bond as well. I love Bardem's commitment to the part and his acting choices, and I love how he feels quite different to any of the main villains we've had in the past. Bardem describes him as an angel of death, someone who exudes grace and style, but who is rotting within. He also executes a standard villain cliche in the best way possible. Many times before, we've seen a villain ask the hero to join him, despite there being little reason given for why the hero might be persuaded by this offer. Silva is essentially offering the world to James after demonstrating that M is continuing to make foolhardy mistakes that could get him killed. And the extra spice that makes this great, Silva never comes out and says, "Join me." This feels like the best of the roles that Bardem could have landed in the series, and I'm so glad he stands as a shining example of villains within the Craig films, which is generally a subset of the series I think has a real problem with its villains. The reintroduction of Q and Moneypenny to the series was a long time coming and very welcome. Ben Whishaw is an inspired choice for the part of Q. He is quite different to dear old Desmond, but he makes a bigger impression than either Cleese or Burton. Thankfully, he's not copying what has been done before, but is instead presenting a new take on the role, much as Craig had done with Bond. He's a highlight in each of his 3 films, though I think his best work is here. I do question how likely it is that a tech genius like him would have allowed for the Trojan horse virus to penetrate MI6's security systems that allow for Silva's escape, but I'm willing to go with it, as Q and Bond's banter during the tube chase is my favorite part of that sequence. I'm less enthusiastic about Naomi Harris's Moneypenny, but I don't want it misconstrued that I dislike her. She's no Lois Maxwell, but she has the right relationship with Bond, keeping it a mystery whether or not they've had sex, but infusing the banter with a fun, flirtatious edge. I just think there are a few awkward bits with her, and while I like the idea that she thinks herself an equal to Bond in the field, she needs a reality check. Funnily enough, I was first introduced to Harris through After the Sunset, the film Pierce Brosnan was doing when he received the call that his tenure with Bond was done, and so I thought she was an interesting choice for the part. Like Wishaw, I'm glad she was kept on for the next 2 films, though her best work is here at the beginning. Ralph Fiennes is another great choice. I love that Fiennes' potential casting as Bond is acknowledged subtly through his backstory of being a field agent, but he admits field work is not for him. Fiennes knows how to keep the audience on the fence about him throughout the film until the end, and his introduction as the new M was a wonderful surprise to me. Mallory is a key part in the film, and in the hands of a less talented actor, this could have been an annoyingly botched character, but he makes for a wonderful addition to the cast and confirms the new Craig quartet of MI6 characters as a solid, recurring, and more active presence in the series. Speaking of which, it was a surprise to me that Rory Kinnear was kept on as Tanner after Quantum, but needless to say, I embraced this choice wholeheartedly. Severine is a great presence, nicely allowing for a more standard Bond woman who is more memorable than poor Strawberry Fields from the last film. Her scenes with Craig are suitably sexy and barbed-wired, each trying to get a read on the other. Her backstory of being in the sex trade does color the shower scene in an unflattering light, but I'm actually good with it because it's pretty clear to me that these are consenting adults, and besides, this is a Bond film. We'd like to see Bond exercise his sexist, misogynist ways at least once in entry. I really have nothing more to say about Patrice than what I've already offered in the Henchman ranking video. Finally, let's talk about Kincaid. His part as the loving but gruff mentor to Bond in his youth is just the right amount of revelation of Bond's backstory we need in the third act. Side note, I'm really glad the decision was made to cast someone like Finney instead of bringing in Sean Connery as was suggested. This would have felt more like stunt casting and definitely would have taken away from Bond and M's story at the end. Also, it's interesting to note that Lee Tamahori also had a similar idea for Die Another Day, though he was going to bring in Connery as an older version of Bond, lending credence to the codename theory, so you can imagine how much I love that idea. Sam Mendes has a strong command of narrative and a solid understanding of both the classic Bond and the Craig interpretation, at least with this entry. And even if I might not agree on each of his inclinations, I highly respect what he's able to put together. In fact, he even improves on some things from previous films. For example, I found a lot of Dennis Gassner's sets for Quantum to be nothing special, but Mendes makes them work here. While I'm not an especially big fan of the Thomas Newman score, it's hard to imagine this film with a different sound. Mendes gets a great performance from just about everyone, and he knows how to build tension within a scene beautifully. I do think his action scenes are generally a step down on a thrill and spectacle level, but the downgrade in spectacle was a conscious move on Mendes' part. My highlights are the jellyfish sequence in Shanghai, the Inquiry shootout, and the finale at Skyfall. But the biggest area of improvement is in the cinematography, and that's because Mendes secured the services of one of our greatest living DPs, Sir Roger Deakins. My goodness, this film is a pleasure to look at. There are so many wonderful shots. The use of silhouettes borders on being as important a theme as anything in the script, and the camera is expertly placed in order to get the most out of every shot. This is a masterclass in visuals, and it is certainly Oscar-worthy. The only issue is that it came out the same year as Life of Pi, which is an incredibly well-photographed film. I generally love Daniel Kleinman's titles in this series, mostly for how different they are from each other and how tied into the films they are. Here, we take a novel approach by keeping the camera moving as if we are descending alongside Bond in the water. We also get quite a few unusual things here, such as seeing Bond both as a boy and then as a man, and generally keeping the naked women to a minimum. It's not my favorite, but it's a fine offering. As far as the music goes, my big problem with Newman's score is that I just don't find his original material that engaging or unique. When I was working on the Bourne retrospective, I had tracks from Skyfall as a temp score, and I wonder how many casual fans would have noticed if I just left them in. Newman has an increased offering of Bond theme over David Arnold's last 2 scores, but they still feel restrained, and I'm starting to get sick of it. Is it a crime now to just let the Bond theme loose in action scenes? Beyond those gripes, Newman does have some solid tracks. I love his track underneath the jellyfish sequence, the twanging Bond theme that plays at several points, like when Bond is pulling out the shrapnel from his body, the solemn horns that play as M's theme, and Bond's entrance into the Macau casino. As much as I would have liked a new version of the James Bond theme for the end credits, I understand Newman's thought process. Arnold did such a terrific job updating it for Casino Royale that all Newman felt he could do was compete with that. Then we have the Adele track. I adore this theme, though much like the film, I didn't have a strong reaction to it at first. It just felt like the title song that would have stepped out of the collective consciousness of fans. But that's also precisely why I've grown to love it. It takes most everything I've loved from past offerings and keeps it in a sultry package. Now, the general tune is perhaps a little more moody than most people would like from a Bond song, and the success of this song I feel is a direct influence on the direction taken for the next two films. I get it, Bond has become a little too morose at times with Craig's portrayal, and we'd like to return to something more fun. But I also have a soft spot for softer, dark, emotional songs, and so I'm a fan of all three of these. I don't think you're stupid for disliking three Oscar-winning songs that are a bit removed from some of the previous great Bond songs of the past. All I ask is that you don't think too harshly of those of us who really like these efforts. Let's end with the usual round of random observations, comments, and further nitpicks. I love the locations chosen here. London is certainly less glamorous than a lot of the others, but it makes sense for the 50th anniversary film. I'm always a fan of returning to Istanbul. Shanghai is a great choice. Love that we return to Macau as well. A nice connection to the man with the golden gun. And we finish in Scotland, which is a place that I've wondered why we've not visited in the past yet. The explosion of the DB5 was emotionally the hardest hitting bit of the movie for me. While I knew it would come back eventually, my heart broke seeing it destroyed like that. And like everyone else, I laughed way too hard at Craig's reaction with the aggressive Bond theme behind it. Of the films post The Living Daylights that have titles with no direct connection to Fleming, Skyfall is perhaps my favorite original title. It has the same sort of mystique and elegance as Moonraker, Diamonds Are Forever, and The Spy Who Loved Me. Want to know my two stupidest nitpicks in the whole series? I hate how short Bond's hair is in this one, and it's really distracting. Craig already has shorter than average hair in each of the other films, so I really hate the length here. Also, can we put a moratorium on the Storm's Coming lines in cinema for about a decade or so? I keep hearing this one crop up in many films, and I'm beyond sick of it. Skyfall is a film that I respect and appreciate more and more as time goes by. Much like Quantum, my viewings of it for the purposes of this review have shifted my evaluation of it a lot, though thankfully much more positively. The reasons for it not getting over the edge into the top 10 are basically how awkward it works as a third film in Craig's run, how it's trying to justify Bond's relevance in a modern world when we've already had 3 films in the last 6 that have done this previously, and because I think the artistic goals of the film get in the way of it being pure entertainment like much of the rest of the series. This is a film that both effortlessly showcases an adoration for the series, and yet at times feels like it's trying too hard to prove that Bond can play with the big boys. It does a lot of what it sets out to do extremely well, and I'm in awe of how this all fits together, but it doesn't quite belong in the upper tiers of the series for me. It's gone up quite a bit from where it started, and maybe someday it will break the barrier to belong in my group of favorites, but it hasn't quite yet. Skyfall proved to be a stunning success. The critical reviews were glowing, with several critics speculating if it was the best in the series. The film finally supplanted Thunderball as being the highest-grossing movie of the series, adjusted for inflation. And it joined the likes of Goldfinger, GoldenEye, and Casino Royale as fondly remembered by casual audiences. With each successful entry, the producers faced the challenge of making a worthy follow-up. 2015 Spectre had quite the gauntlet thrown down in front of it, and it was a history-making film as well. But the fourth film in an actor's tenure is rarely considered by the majority as one of the better ones. But that's not going to stop Eon from expanding on the world of Bond to deliver an adventure with its roots squarely in the glory days of the past.